Lord Miller, laughing Vajra, I call to you. Lord Miller, laughing Vajra, I call to you. Oh, it's just me now. Hi.
Sorry,
We go for refuge to all the Buddhas, so that all sentient beings may realize Buddhahood. We go for refuge to all the Buddhas, so that all sentient beings may realize Buddhahood. We go for refuge to all the Buddhas, so that all sentient beings may realize Buddhahood. Right. So, last night I was giving you the whole context within which we're going to be exploring the whole topic of emptiness and insight this year, how it fits in with all the things we've been doing over past years and intend to carry on doing in years to come, and a little bit of introduction to what we're going to be doing today. So I'm going to just emphasize again the relevance of insight and emptiness, realizing not self, self and not self, and so on, which sound quite philosophical and possibly even dependent origination and so on, possibly rather intellectually challenging, perhaps. And is that relevant to our heart wish of love and compassion for ourselves and all beings, and wishing them to be free from suffering? And this is, as I said yesterday, the special quality, a special thing about what the Buddha taught, that he was addressing this question of happiness and suffering and the cessation of suffering. Like what is suffering? What's the origin of it? And is that just how it is, or is it possible for there to be a cessation of it? That's what he wasn't particularly talking about, like the scientific world might be trying to, I want to understand what everything is just because I want to know. But I want to relieve suffering. I want to relieve the sufferings of beings. So it's directly connected to love and compassion. And in the Metta Sutta, it says, develop this love and compassion and then remain free from all views. And when it says all views, this is the Buddha saying, well, the trouble is we do have views. We're attached to our views and our wrong views. And because of that attachment to our wrong views and views and the whole process of holding a view, we're not actually able to realize liberation, and we're therefore not able to liberate others, ultimately. So they're absolutely bound up with each other. And in the Mahamudra prayers, where we, for example, Ranjan Dorji's prayer, he talks about how, you look at the nature of your mind and you recognize it's empty, whatever that means, But then when you learn to rest without any views, again, this idea of a prapancha or view or something you've created, an idea you've created rather than the thing itself, the reality itself. When you're released from all that, then that power within ourselves of love and compassion just spontaneously is there. We don't have to create it. So again, the two are very closely related, whether you come in through wanting to understand more deeply your true nature, whether you come in just wanting the ending of suffering. Both are motivated, wanting the ending of suffering, but that sense of riding on the heart wish and longing for happiness for yourself and others, and longing for them to be free from suffering, which you're never away from. That's always there. always driving you. So you can kind of rely on that. And if you're relying on that and you give up views through your meditation practice, you give up this attachment and vipassana and false views, that love and compassion then can just have full reign, and it becomes total bodhicitta, the power to work to benefit beings indefinitely. Indefinitely. Your job's never done. There's never a moment where you can say it's all done, because it's not in time anyway. It's all right. Okay, so I just wanted to emphasize that again, and that in order for all beings to have that complete awakening that will never diminish or fail, and to rest in equal love for all beings, recognizing they're all expressions of Buddha nature, again relies on right view. So that's what we're looking at this year, right view. And I thought I would go straight in. Oh yeah, just one more point. When we say the verse, here there's nothing to remove, nothing to add. The one who sees the truth of being by seeing the truth is liberated. You've got that same message of there isn't anything. There's like, you think you've got all these obstacles and obstructions and fascias and that need to be removed. So you're sort of taking them to be something that needs to be removed, which is a view. And then we think we need to attain Buddhahood because it's something we haven't got, which again is a view. So if you give up those views and you see things, see reality as it truly is, you truly see what true reality, as it were, then actually there is liberation. There isn't anything else. That's it. So that's the whole path in a nutshell. So we say it every meditation session. So one of these days we'll really get it. And I just said to Tara, I want to change the wording of that of the verse that we do from the one who sees, because it isn't really there in the Tibetan or the Sanskrit. There isn't a the one, but I put it in because it seemed to need it grammatically. But since then I've changed my mind. I think grammatically you don't need it. You can say truly seeing reality as it truly is liberation. You don't, I mean, although you can, the noun then becomes a gerund, isn't it? For those who appreciate grammar. So yeah, we're on to it. And of course, that opening verse, where when he says mere dependently arising, it might sound a little bit dismissive. So maybe we could change that translation a little bit, but because dependently arising, as we're going to see, is amazing. I was looking at the arising as opposed to origin, because it's actually the truth of origin of suffering. And I was going to my English dictionary and the Tibetan dictionary and the Sanskrit and trying to work out, is origin and cause the same or different? That's a good question, isn't it? I think it is quite significantly different. So it's the origin of suffering. So we can think about that some more as we come back to these teachings again and again. So what I want to do now is to just read through to you the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta and the Kachaya Sutta, which we will be referring to and coming back to again and again. So as many times as we go through it, the more times you read it, the more familiar you'll be with the structure of these teachings and their significance. So this is the first sermon of the Buddha. Thus I heard, on one occasion, this is a translation by Nyanamoli Thera. Partly I've also changed some of it, looking at other people's translations. Thus I heard, on one occasion the Blessed One was living at Benares in the deer park at Isipatana, the resort of seers. There he addressed the bhikkhus of the group of 5. Bhikkhus, these 2 extremes ought not to be cultivated by one gone forth from the house life. What are the 2? There is devotion to indulgence of pleasure in objects of the sensual desire, which is inferior, low, vulgar, noble and leads to no good. And there is devotion to self-torment, which is painful, ignoble, and leads to no good. So if you remember, he's just become enlightened. This is that small group of ascetics who've all been practicing asceticism together. So this is his first statement. The middle way, discovered by the perfect one, avoids both these extremes. It gives vision, it gives knowledge, and leads to peace. That's a cessation of suffering. It leads to peace, to direct acquaintance, to discovery and to nirvana, which we'll be looking at. And what is that middle way? It is simply the noble eightfold path. That is to say, right view. It starts with right view. So you could understand that on various levels, but here we're talking about the deepest level. Right view, right resolve, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, right concentration. So those all follow on from right view and in the light of right view. You're taking the right view from that first glimpse, if you like, to its full realization in a samadhi of right view, as it were, sort of unwavering because it's complete. And that is the middle way discovered by a perfect one, which gives vision, which gives knowledge, which leads to peace, to direct acquaintance, to discovery, to nirvana. So that's the eightfold path. And then he goes on about he talks about the Four Noble Truths. So there's Four Noble Truths: the truth of suffering. There's the Arya truth, the truth of those who've actually gone beyond samsara, the Aryas. The truth of suffering. So it's not just an ordinary, what we would understand by suffering, but that really, really, like Queen Shamatha says, the real suffering that's all pervading as long as we're not awakened. So suffering, the origin of suffering is the second, cessation of suffering is the third, and the path leading to cessation is the fourth. So we're going to be looking at this again and again in more and more detail. And so each of those four truths have three levels to them. First, there is a truth. He's stating there is these four truths. That's number one. These four truths can be recognized, can be, what was the word they used? Yes, can be understood or recognized or comprehended. That's the first one. These, the second one can be abandoned. The origin of suffering can be given up, can cease, as it were. The third one is that, this is cessation, can be cultivated, can be verified, actually, that's it. And the fourth one can be developed, the path. We can pursue it or cultivate it or develop the path, sort of follow the path. So that's the second point, that this is possible to do something about them. And the third point of each one is that, and I've done that. I've recognized suffering, and I know what it is. I can really tell you what it is from my own experience. I've realized it, and I have. What's the second one? And I've given up suffering. Yeah, the second one, I've given up the origin of suffering. So it no longer. I've actually done it. Not only is it possible to do it, but I've done it. And the third one is I have actually verified the cessation of suffering. I've actually proved that it's true myself within my own experience. So this is, and then finally, I've actually pursued the path. I've followed the path. So I'm not only telling you that these things are true, I'm saying that actually they can be verified by you in your own experience. And I know that because I've done it. So, I'm a person you could listen to. So I'll just read how he's expressing it, because you've got the sense now. Otherwise, it's so repetitious. Sometimes you lose you lose track. So anyway, suffering as a noble truth is this. Birth is suffering, aging is suffering, sickness is suffering, death is suffering, sorrow and lamentation, pain, grief, and despair are suffering. Association with the loathed is suffering, dissociation from the loved is suffering, not to get what one wants is suffering. In short, suffering is the 5 categories of the clinging to the 5 aggregates. So it's kind of, can't disagree with that, can we? But it's at a very deep level. I mean, even birth itself, the very fact of that. Okay, the origin of suffering as a noble truth is this. It is the craving or thirsting that produces further becoming, of being accompanied by delight or passion and attachment and relishing this and that. In other words, craving for sensual pleasure, craving for being, and craving for non-being, which is interesting, isn't it? Craving to exist or craving to not exist. Like that continuous sense of dissatisfaction. So that's the second one. And the third one is the cessation of suffering as a noble truth, an Arya truth. This is this. It is remainderless fading and ceasing, giving up, relinquishing, letting go of and rejecting or detachment from that same craving. So this origin of suffering, which is sort of turns on craving, which we will see in a moment, is related to paticca samuppada. So then we come to the second point. The fourth truth, the path leading to cessation of suffering as a noble truth is this. It is simply the noble eightfold path. That is to say, right view, again, you see, it's repeating what's above, right resolve, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, right concentration. Or an interesting translation was right mental unification. I like that. Anyway, then so then it goes through the 3 aspects of each. Suffering as a noble truth is this. Such was the vision, the knowledge, the understanding, the finding, the illumination that arose. And he keeps repeating that it arose, this arose in regard to things not heard by me before. So for him, this was a complete revelation that arose in him. So then it comes to the second aspect. This suffering as a noble truth can be recognized, diagnosed even. Such was the vision, the knowledge, the understanding, the finding, the light that arose, or the illumination that arose in regard to things not heard by me before. So it's not just your ordinary understanding, it's an understanding that completely comes new to him with this new way of seeing. This suffering as a noble truth has been recognized as a third aspect. Such was the vision, the knowledge, the understanding, the finding, the illumination that arose in regard to things not heard by me before. That's the first noble truth. And the second noble truth, the origin of suffering as a noble truth is this one. Such was a vision, and so on, and understanding. This origin of suffering as a noble truth can be abandoned. That's 2. Such was the vision, and so on. This origin of suffering as a noble truth has been abandoned. I've done it. Such was the vision, and so on. Then the third one, cessation of suffering as a noble truth, is this. Such was the vision, and so on. This cessation of suffering as a noble truth can be verified. And this noble truth has been verified. Such was the vision, and so on. Then the fourth noble truth, the path leading to cessation of suffering as a noble truth is this. Such was the vision, and so on. This path leading to cessation of suffering as a noble truth can be developed, pursued, or practiced. Such was the vision, that arose in me. This way, this path leading to the cessation of suffering as a noble truth has been developed by me. I've done it. Okay, such was the vision, the understanding, the finding, the illumination that arose in regard to things not heard by me before. As long as my knowing and seeing the nature of reality was not quite perfected or purified in these 12 aspects, in these 3 phases of each of the 4 noble truths, I did not claim in the world with its gods, its maras and high divinities, high gods, in this generation with its monks and Brahmins, with its princes and men, to have discovered the full awakening that is supreme. I didn't claim it. But as soon as my knowing and seeing the true nature of reality was quite purified or perfected in these 12 aspects, in these 3 phases of each of the 4 noble truths, then I claimed to the world with its gods, its maras, and high divinities, in this generation with its monks and Brahmins, its princes and men, to have discovered the full awakening that is supreme. Knowing and seeing arose in me thus. My heart's deliverance is unassailable. This is the last birth. Now there is no renewal of being. So he said that, and then, that's what the Blessed One said, the bhikkhus of the group of 5 were glad, and they approved his words. Now, during this utterance, there arose, like in the Buddha, there arose in Venerable Konodanya the spotless, immaculate vision of the Dharma eye. What is subject to arising is all subject to cessation. I mean, it sounds quite well. I mean, everyone knows that, but actually, clearly his whole demeanor showed that he saw it in quite a different way. When the Dharma chakra had thus been set rolling by the Blessed One, the earth gods raised the cry at Benares in the deer park at Isipatana that matchless Dharma wheel has been set rolling by the Blessed One, not to be stopped by monk or divine or God or death. I like this way, not to be stopped by monk. Start with the monks, they're the worst. God, death angel or high divinity or anyone in the world. On hearing the earth gods cry, all the gods in the 6 paradises of the sensual sphere took up the cry till it reached beyond the retinue of high divinity in the sphere of pure form. And so indeed, in that hour, at that moment, the cry soared up to the world of high divinity, and the 10,000-fold cosmos shook and rocked and quaked, and a great measureless radiance surpassing the very nature of the gods was displayed in the world. So it wasn't, well, yeah, of course, everything that rises ceases. It was like, so it reminds me of Rinpoche's verse where it's of Timilarapa, may your auspiciousness fill the whole universe. It's like when you realize this, it's like real revelation. Turns everything upside down, and everything you thought is completely opposite to what you thought is fact. So let's get a bit of that sense of the wonder of that. Then the Blessed One uttered the exclamation, Kondanya knows, and that's how that Venerable One acquired the name Anyana Kondanya who knows. It's dramatic, isn't it? So how am I doing? Not too bad. So I now want to read the other sutra that we're going to be referring to again and again, called the Kachaya Sutta. And I was very interested. I've been looking at Madhyamaka, the Mula Madhyamaka Karikas by Nagarjuna. And it's very clear that all his arguments are based on these kind of scriptures. And he's got them very much in mind and actually mentions Katayana in the Karikas. So there's a very direct link with the Mahayana Sutras there, because the Karikas, I think they slightly predate some of the Mahayana Sutras. I don't know the history of it too well, but Yeah, it looks like he was referring to these sutras rather than the Mahayana sutras, and he was really arguing with the Sutantrikas, the schools which were Abhidharma schools that were very much into talking about what existed and what didn't exist in a very, like the Dharmas all exist and these are what the Dharmas are, and that's what are being attacked in the characters. That doesn't make sense. You can't say that. And of course, in the Heart Sutra, it's saying the same. You can't really say that. So this is where emptiness gets to be emphasized much more than perhaps the Buddha didn't use emptiness as much, perhaps, as you get in. He used other terms which we'll be looking at, but it's all very interesting. Yeah. So now I'm going to read to you the Kachaya Nagata Sutta so that you've got a sense of where we're going. So this is Thanissaro Bhikkhu's translation I'm going to read. So, dwelling at Savatthi, then the Venerable Kachaya Nagata approached the Blessed One, and on arrival, having bowed down, sat to one side. As he was sitting there, he said to the Blessed One, Lord, right view, it said. To what extent is there right view? It's great, isn't it? By and large, Kachayana, the world is supported by, or takes as its object, or you could say almost obsessed by, a polarity, that of existence and non-existence. And he talks about the world, beings in the world who are sort of trying to think their way through this. But when one sees the origination of the world, again, the world of suffering, the world of samsara, as it actually is, with right discernment, non-existence with reference to the world doesn't occur to one. So when you're looking at the origin of suffering, you don't ask yourself, well, does suffering exist? You're looking at the origin of suffering. So you don't need a view about whether it exists or not. What you need is, you want liberation from suffering. You're not going to talk about whether it exists or not. So it's a really important point, because he's very careful not to hold a view things exist and not to hold views that don't exist. But about the world with all its suffering, you wouldn't say it didn't exist. What would be the point? If you're suffering and you're looking at the origin of suffering, either in yourself or others, you take it as a kind of given that then you look to see what's the origin of it. So it doesn't occur to you to say it doesn't exist. When one sees the cessation of the world, suffering, as it actually is, with right discernment, existence with reference to the world doesn't occur to one. So when you've seen the origin of suffering, when you see it as it truly is, well, that is liberation. There isn't any suffering to talk about. So you wouldn't then say, it existed. So there's no need for these views of existence or not existence, basically. By and large, Kachayana, this world is in bondage to attachment. Oh, have I done that? Oh, no, that's right. Clinging, biases. But one such as this does not get involved with or cling to these attachments, clingings, fixations of awareness, biases, obsessions, nor is he resolved on myself. He has no uncertainty or doubt that just suffering when arising is arising, suffering when passing is passing away. All right, that's his translation. He uses stress instead of dukkha. In this, his knowledge is independent of others. It's to this extent, Kachayana, that there is right view, yes. There's no doubt about this is suffering, the origin of suffering, the cessation of suffering. He's in no doubt about that. This is his knowledge, independent of others. This is his own inner knowing, if you like. Everything exists. That's one extreme. Everything does not exist. That is a second extreme. Avoiding these two extremes, the Tathagata teaches the Dharma via the middle. So we're back to the first Dhammacakka sermon. From ignorance or avidya as a requisite condition comes fabrication. So now these are the 12 links of the Paticca Samuppada. From fabrications as a prerequisite conditions comes consciousness. From consciousness as a requisite condition comes name and form. From name and form as a requisite condition comes the sixth sense media. From the sixth sense media as a requisite condition comes contact. From contact as a requisite condition comes feeling. From feeling as a requisite condition comes craving. From craving as a requisite condition comes what? Thirsting. Clinging. From clinging as a requisite condition comes becoming. From becoming as a requisite condition comes birth. From birth as a requisite condition comes aging and death, sorrow, lamentation, pain, distress, and despair come into play. Such is the origination of this entire mass of stress and suffering, as he calls it. So we're going to be looking at this with Dashu in the next session, or even a bit more later in this session. Now, from the remainderless fading or cessation and cessation of that very ignorance or avidya comes the cessation of fabrications. From the cessation of fabrications comes the cessation of consciousness. From the cessation of consciousness comes cessation of name and form. From name and form comes cessation of the sixth sense media. From the cessation of the sixth sense media comes the cessation of contact. From the cessation of contact comes the cessation of feeling. From the cessation of feeling comes the cessation of craving. From the cessation of craving comes the cessation of clinging. From the cessation of clinging comes the cessation of becoming. From the cessation of becoming comes the cessation of birth. From the cessation of birth comes aging. Then aging, death, and sorrow, lamentation, pain, distress, and despair all cease. Such is the cessation of this entire mass of suffering. So you've got the overview now of the sutra, and we'll be looking at it in more and more detail and relating it to what we have in our own Mahamudra tradition, relating to what we have in the pointing out instructions that we get through the Mahamudra tradition, and seeing that is just the same simple message, actually, that we recognize what needs to be given up and we give it up. Give up, and you recognize what is to be realized, and you learn to, you discover it and you trust it, and you enter that. You let that be the truth, as it were. You give up your resistance to that truth. Very simple message, actually. And the Buddha is very consistent in his not going along with any kind of view, grasped at view. And that's what we need to learn in our meditation. Shamatha and Vipassana, we need to learn what are these assumptions, these assumed positions that we have that we don't even notice we've got, that underpin the whole mass of suffering. We've got these, what seem like, we just think the world's like that. We don't think that's something that I've assumed or I've made up or it's a view. But actually, it's these deeply held views that we can't really see. They're not like passing thoughts. They're like the structure of, it's like and this is what Manda's going to, Dash is going to talk about. It's like some sort of mandala structure that it's all of a piece that when you see it, it collapses. But as long as you don't see it, it's just all there somehow, in some gross or less gross form. So this is what Dash is going to take us through. He's going to start this weekend, and then hopefully we're going to have opportunities for everybody to take it deeper over time. So I particularly wanted to get Dashu to talk about this, because when he was in retreat, he had the time and opportunity to really look at the Pali sources. He went through the whole thing, and he was looking at different studies and combining that with his meditation. So he was, following the formless meditation that we teach, and the Mahamudra instructions that you've got in the various texts I mentioned yesterday. So he was working with those together, and at the same time doing looking at the Pali because I'd really asked him to do that. And he really got into that. He got the bit between his teeth. And when he came out, he was very, he was telling me everything that he'd discovered. And I got very excited by that. I thought, this is really so affirming for our tradition, that we can actually use these Pali sources combined with the pointing out instructions and use them as pointing out instructions, which in a way doesn't make Mahamudra and Dzogchen something that's kind of developed late, but actually is how to look at what we've had all along. And you'll find elements within the Buddhist tradition that have the same understanding that we have. And then you'll find elements in the tradition as a whole which don't have the same understanding. And when you trace them back, that's usually because they're not particularly into meditation, they're more into philosophical discussion. So this is a whole area for us to bear in mind with our own Sangha, like how do we keep that alive, that inner transmission of the inner meaning, that at the same time as the rigor of being able to think clearly and to express things clearly and to put the counter arguments to people who have got caught up in that kind of discussion. That we can actually help people by answering their questions and queries that arise from when you hear all these different views about what things mean in the Dharma. So I'm very keen that we, at least some part of our Sangha is quite well versed in this, these early sutras. I mean, there's the Pali Sutras. There are other early sutras as well, you know, in other, but I think the Pali is so well documented and so complete, and it's so well studied, and there's such good, you know, as I said, such good scholastic work has been done on it, and by practitioners, that we've got a lot to draw on there. So that's my. I've got a lot of enthusiasm for this, as you have noticed. And I think there's something very direct and simple about these sutras, aren't there? There's a lot of atmosphere in them. You know, you get the sense of the story behind and the questions and the way they ask the questions. What is this right view? You know, there he is. He's heard it over and over again. And he still comes and dares to say to the Buddha, "This, you know, I keep hearing right view, right view. What is right view? You know, let's get right down to basics. Let's be truthful. I've heard it many times, but I still don't know what it means." This is the kind of way we need to approach the teachings, to kind of recognize that. So now I would really like to hand over to Dashu. I was saying to him this morning, he wasn't expecting to speak this morning, but I think I've said what I need to say, and I want him to, he needs time to develop what he has to say, so he could give us a bit of background and perhaps some of his experience when in retreat about studying these things, and where he's hoping to take us with it. So over to you, Dashu.
Can you hear me okay? Yeah, as Lama was just saying, I wasn't expecting to talk this morning. I had imagined I still had another 5 hours of preparation. And so, and I'd also only planned to sort of give a good presentation for about an hour or so. So yeah, 8:30 this morning, Lama said, well, you know, come in and sort of talk a little bit about it. So I've got a few words of introduction, I suppose. So when I went into retreat, I was really engaged with this idea that somehow I noticed that in myself, I didn't have a lot of faith in what I was seeing within the Tibetan kind of presentations of Dharma. And it's not because I didn't have faith in the way that Lama Shenpen was teaching. And it's not that I didn't have faith in the meditation and kind of the insights that were coming from that, so much as I just noticed this kind of slight anxiety around some of the Tibetan texts, and so when Lama encouraged me to look at the Pali sources, I was really enthusiastic, because I thought, okay, well, at least now I'll be able to get this, to get some kind of grounding, and I was really keen to see how our, as Lama was just saying, how the Mahamudra tradition and the way that we're presented the teachings, where that comes in and how it comes in from the early sources. And one of the first texts I was looking at was Peter Macefield's book on divine revelation in early Buddhism. And it really starts with the importance of recognizing the difference between approaching the teachings from the realization of the noble ones, compared to just seeing them in sort of ordinary terms, and also that the whole path begins with right view. And that was where I started off from. And then I wanted to see, okay, is there anything here that relates to the pointing out instructions? Is there anything that relates, how does the meditation fit in here? How do our ideas of receiving the adhisthana of the Buddha, how does that fit in with these teachings? One of the lines that really stood out for me in Tashi Namgyal's book on Mahamudra, Moonbeams of Mahamudra. Anyone who came to the Shamatha retreat in January will remember me saying this. There's just this 2-line sentence in an 800-page book where Tashi Namgyal quotes Gampopa as saying, the causes for Shamatha and Vipassana are adhisthana of the Guru, dependent origination, accumulation of punya and jnana, kind of merit and wisdom, and the purification of the obscurations. And it's just 2 lines. And I really wanted to kind of delve into that a lot more, because it was saying here, this is the cause of Shamatha and Vipassana. And of course, you know, I'm in a 1-year solitary meditation retreat, and I thought it might be helpful if at least I had the causes of developing the meditation. So the sense of purification, I wanted to see where does that come in. It seems to imply that the vision is obscured, and the vision that is obscured by our, well, in the Pali calling them hindrances, obstacles. And so where is purification mentioned? Where are these obstacles mentioned? And these are obscuring our vision to seeing the true nature of reality as it really is. At the beginning of Lama's session there, with Milarepa saying, you see the true nature, the Dharmata, that is the essence of all dependent arising. So, you know, seeing the true nature of that, and then recognizing that sort of, where does this sense of faith come in terms of receiving the blessings or receiving the adhisthana of the mandala of awakening of the Buddha, of the Dharma and the Sangha. So I was very interested in seeing if I could find early sources with that. And so maybe this afternoon, I was thinking I could talk a little bit about, as Lama's been saying with the 4 Noble Truths, to talk a little bit about the first 2. The way to look at what the Buddha is terming dukkha here, and the place from which it originates. And how this relates to the pointing out instructions is very interesting, because I found a number of places where the Buddha says, right here is where to look, stay right there. Not just simply kind of, yes, craving is the origination of suffering, but it's right here that it originates. And you stay and you see the drawback, you see the faults, you see why it's happening, and then staying right there, the wisdom can naturally emerge. And this term emergence, I think, is an interesting one, because the word of uppada from the paticca samuppada has the connotation of the movement of emergence. So you can see how it gets translated into arising or origin, but the paticca bit is kind of like sometimes the support, and uppada, the movement of emergence or the movement of origin from that which is supporting it. And so we're talking here, if the essence of all of this is the true nature of being, the true nature of our mind, it seems really vital that we're able to see how it's caused, how it turns into dukkha, and of course how we might be liberated from that. So I won't say too much about it in this session, but I wanted to bring in a text that I think is quite important here, which is the story of Suta, who is a leper. And Suta comes across the Buddha teaching. His name means wide awake, the wide awake leper. I'm going to put my robe on, it's cold. His name is Wide Awake, and he's just begging for food, and he sees the Buddha teaching, and the Buddha is surrounded by a large assembly. And the Buddha's giving a Dharma talk. And Suta thinks, well, maybe if I hang around, there'll be some food, and I could get some scraps. It describes him as a wretched man, bits falling off. And so his first motivation is just to hang around and see if there's any food on offer. And then he realizes that the Buddha is teaching the Dharma, and he thinks, well, maybe, what if I sat and listened? Maybe I could hear the Dharma. So he sat on the edge of the assembly. At that moment, the Buddha scanned the assembly. And it's quite interesting that he's in the middle of talking, or he's in the middle of giving a teaching. And at the same time, it describes him kind of scanning the assembly to see if there's anyone who's actually able to hear what he has to say. And in his, let's say, his divine awareness, he realizes Super Buddha has all the possible connections that would allow him to really hear the true Dharma. So he carries on talking, but he's directing it primarily at the leper. All these other people, but he's directing it primarily at the leper. And he goes through the standard process of teaching, where he talks about ethics and morality. He talks about the heavens and the hells. And he talks about how the suffering that we experience within this realm is caused by our habitual patterns, and that lead us into unwholesome actions, leading to suffering, leading to unwholesome results. So he teaches this as a preliminary. And then at some point, he recognizes that Super Buddha's mind is now ready. And it describes it as saying, his mind is ready, his heart is tender. And the translation for his heart is tender is the same word as mudita here. Mm. His heart is tender, his mind is uplifted, it is malleable. And this is a really interesting phrase, because malleable here means free from the hindrances, free from the obstructions. And so as he recognizes this, and that sort of description of the way that Super Buddha's mind is also the same description that comes in the Mahamudra texts, that this is the quality of Shamatha, that it's pliable, Xinjiang. It's ready, it's clear, it's uplifted. And then he teaches the Dharma that is known by the awakened ones. Suffering, its origin, its cessation, and the path, which in the Satipatthana Sutta is now the investigation of the Dharmas. And that happens, this is the Vipassana stage. So we've had the Shamatha, his mind is ready in that place, and then he gets given the insight into the nature of suffering, origin, cessation, and the path. And at that point, the analogy is, as his mind is clear, it's like a clean cloth, completely free of dust, that could take on the dye. So is his mind clean, free of dust. And at that moment, he realizes he realizes the true Dharma, and is at a point of awakening that he won't turn back from. And he realizes all that is subject to arising is subject to cessation. It's the same as what Lama was just saying with Kondanya. And he goes to the Buddha and he says, it's amazing. I've seen it. And the Buddha says, well done, off you go. And of course, all of the Buddha's monks at that point, so the leper sort of goes off in his, on his enlightened way. And all the monks around him go, hang on a minute. How did that happen to him? We're sitting here listening to the same talk. How come he got enlightened and we're still sitting here and we don't really know what you're talking about? And the Buddha says, actually, in a past life, the reason he ended up as a leper, and he's been a leper for kalpas, is because he'd insulted I can't remember exactly because it's in a different story, but he'd insulted a Pratyeka Buddha, saying these wandering yogins going around collecting and begging for food, they should go out and get a job. Something like that. And that act of criticizing the holy being actually led him to being a leper for the next, however many lifetimes. But before then, he had a lot of the connections were all still there because he'd actually met one of these enlightened beings, even if he'd dismissed him. He had the connections to meet him, and then of course he had the connections that would allow him to be in presence of the Buddha at the same time that the Buddha was able to point out the true nature of reality to him. And what's interesting here is the Buddha knew this is the point to give him the teachings. And Macefield in his book makes the point that no one gets enlightened without this direct connection with awakening, direct connection with the mandala of awakening, or the teachings of the Buddha, which of course fits very well with what we were saying, to receive the adhisthana of the Guru. And this is the cause of Shamatha and Vipassana. We can talk a little bit this afternoon about dependent arising. But the purification of obscurations, the Super Buddha's mind, this thing about malleable, is at that moment, one of the terms for equanimity is it's free from the hindrances of grasping, doubt, and sloth and torpor. It's the same kind of process. So you get to a point within our meditation practice where we get those moments of equanimity and not grasping. It's at that point we can bring in some of the Vipassana exercises, and we kind of spiral around. So, and then we fall back into it. We carry on. We kind of fade, the complete fading away of that grasping. And when we get a moment of that, we can investigate. So we start seeing how these processes work. And tomorrow I'll talk a bit about how faith is necessary in terms of this same practice of listening to the Dharma and meeting the teacher, having the right kind of mindfulness and awareness to align ourselves with the wholesome actions, which will then free us from, set us on the emergence out of grasping into liberation. And just kind of wanted to back up really what Lama was talking about when she was saying, when we're looking at insight into emptiness, and when we're looking at something like these supposedly quite technical doctrinal teachings, I think it's really important. We might recognize those parts of ourselves that go, oh, I'm not really interested in doctrine or these teachings or philosophy, and it's really important. This is not what we're talking about. This is an essential component for our meditation practice, and it's an essential component of recognizing how our daily life awareness practice comes in. That actually the way we are in the world has an impact on the way that we sit in meditation, and they feed into each other in this kind of accumulation, or aligning with the mandala of awakening to accumulate that kind of power of adhisthana and the wisdom that comes from reflecting on these teachings. They're part of the same world, part of the same mandala. So this is not about philosophical theory. This is about meditative practice. And so when we come back this afternoon, just to kind of keep that in mind, when the Buddha was teaching Super Buddha, he didn't give him these profound teachings until his mind was ready, was in that kind of quality of shamatha. And so I think it would be really helpful if, before we come together, we at least take a little bit of time to settle ourselves and open and kind of rest as best we can, so that when we're taking part in this discussion, it's coming from that place of meditation. And that's probably all I need to say for the setting up. What I might also, because these teachings on dependent origination, in the Pali sources, there are, you get kind of the different kinds of books. And one of them is a collection of teachings on nirdanas, on connections, on praticca samuppada. And there's like 280 in that one book alone. Plus there's other teachings on dependent origination that come right through the suttas. So you're looking at sort of over 300 suttas. And of course, we've only got an hour this afternoon and an hour tomorrow morning, so we're not likely to really be able to get into it in much depth. However, what I will invite is anybody who really wants to look at these texts and in technical detail, going through some of the language, going through some of the terms, looking at how these terms relate to each other, and where we find the same term used in different contexts. I'm really looking forward to taking a group, probably, let's say in March, and I will invite anyone who wants to go through in that kind of detail. We can go through it in a weekly class. I also want to invite you to a learning Pali grammar, learning Pali language class. I won't be teaching that, obviously. But there are a couple of very interesting classes coming up, one with the Oxford University and one with a Pali and Sanskrit scholar. So anybody who's interested in that, I'll make a sort of a form so that you can sign up. And if you want to go through that, we can take our time and really go through it properly. But just for this afternoon and tomorrow morning, I'll really be sort of giving a bit of an overview in terms of this afternoon, the first two noble truths, and tomorrow morning, how faith and meditation are the path for us into the unconditioned. The first two is all about what is conditioned, which is impermanent, it's dukkha. And then tomorrow morning, talk about the path to the unconditioned, which is sukha. Oh, nirvana. So that's probably enough of an introduction.
Thank you.
Lama, did you have anything that you'd like to ask, or anything that you think I might have missed out that you'd like me to say?
No. I'm thinking, yes, I hope I get time that I can join your classes, looking at the Pali grammar more. And because, we are working with translation all the time. And one of the drawbacks of working with text is that you can't ask the actual writer of the text what they meant. So it's all deduction. Whereas when I've been learning from my own teachers, I was able to talk, especially with Riggs and Shikpa, I was able to talk in English. So that was a big advantage. And then talking with Rinpoche, I talked in Tibetan, so I had more chance to find out what he meant when he said things. But when you look at texts, you're left with guessing what the author of the text, how they were using words, or you can be more informed. And as Dash has discovered, if you compare different contexts, you can start to have an informed sense of how those words are being used. And I think that the Pali sources you get, like in access to insight, you've got different translators, good translators, and what they've chosen to use as a translation. And so then you got a sense of how you might translate it into English. You've got a choice of words. And the Tibetan is such a different kind of language. So sometimes I find to understand the Tibetan, I like to look at the Sanskrit or Pali, and then I get a better sense of what the Tibetan is doing, what it found it had to do in order to put it into Tibetan. But then in English, you've got other options because English is a different kind of language. So that's why the living tradition is so important, because you're getting the dialogue sort of from person to person, and then you're supported by words. And the words, the meaning of the words depends on what the person-to-person communication is about, if you see what I mean. It's kind of, it's not like, well, in the book it says this, therefore it means that. Well, it depends how the person was using the word in the book. So I think that's an important part of what's happening now that Dharma is coming into the West. It's coming into our language and what our language can do. And only we know what effect that language is having on us. That's why in discovering the heart of Buddhism, I get you to explore your experience and what words you use for it. Because, you know what words get you to that place of liberation, that place of aha moments, as it were, that aliveness, that the play between words and what goes on between people is not exactly the words, is it? The words can trigger something, but then it's more something else that's going on that can affirm, oh, when I used that word, where did they go? And you sense, oh, I see. They went exactly to where I meant them to go, because now they've come back to me in this living way. And then if I use a word and they go clunk, you can think, oh, hang on. Use another word or another facial expression or a hesitation or a pause or some body language, which I find really interesting, that often when students are trying to explain to me their experience, suddenly they become very clear. I can really follow them. I really get where they are. And at the end, they so often say, I'm not making any sense, am I? It's interesting, isn't it? So often. Because they were speaking from their experience, and I was picking that up. And where they were going, I was going, because, we're not different, actually. So it's really interesting. And the important point was that they were trying to be as honest as they could, which then enabled me to go with them. Whereas if they're just sticking with the words, the question is, how are they using them? What do they mean by them? So we're going to keep coming across this, especially, this is why it's a good idea to be familiar with at least one of these languages, whether it's Pali, Sanskrit, or Tibetan, all three, or, bring in Chinese, Japanese. You can always learn something more coming in from a slightly different angle, using different language. Or in the English, you look at different translations and just look at what you yourself, what comes alive in you, what words are having an effect on you, and make sure that you're using that resource. You have this resource. We've got a wonderful language, actually. English is a wonderful language. It's got all sorts of nuances and plays in it, hasn't it? So that's all I want to add at the moment. Has that triggered anything in you, Dashu?
Only just to say that, to sort of finish off the first point I made, which was having spent all this time looking at the Pali sources, I now have much more faith in how the Tibetans are presenting. I'm finding, I think what you were just saying, kind of how does the Tibetan word come from the Pali or from the Sanskrit? And what I'm finding I was just reading Jewel Ornament of Liberation last night for kind of tips about faith, and finding, okay, that's why they focus so much on this, because actually there's this whole wealth of sutras that really make this a big point. And then this, okay, yeah, of course, that's the next stage. So, seeing that the Tibetans are not doing anything different, which is very heartening. Which you wouldn't expect them to.
No. And it gives you faith in the whole transmission process, doesn't it? That actually it's still on course after 2,500 years. I mean, that's amazing, isn't it? Wonderful.
And just what you said then about transmission, this was something else that came up for me a lot in my retreat, was that when you were reading out the first sermon, that it gets a bit repetitive. But actually what I found was that there was something about the repetition that allowed me to open and open and open, so that every time I was reading a sutta, it felt like I was receiving the transmission. I've noticed that with Khenpo Rinpoche as well, with recordings of his talking about mind is completely pure and I completely pure, are not dual, cannot be made dual, are not separate and are not different. And then to repeat it for every single one of the skandhas, dhatus, ayatanas, and somehow the kind of repetition of that. So I really kind of encourage anyone reading it to allow themselves the time to read them in that repetitive way. And, when you've got 280 something suttas in the Samyutta, Nidana Samyutta, essentially they're just repeating the same thing over and over again with slightly subtle changes in some of the texts. And it's those subtle changes that then jump out as being, oh, this is really important. Because all the others said exactly the same thing. This is saying something slightly different, and it gives a new context to it. So, yes, the transmission side of that, not just in terms of when the Buddha talking to his disciples and them getting the realization that actually the transmission of the text in that spirit of meditation and reading them in that quality. And yeah, I think it's quite a profound experience.
It's interesting that, isn't it, that in the Tibetan tradition, there's this kind of the idea of the ritual reading, the ritual that's been passed on. And so you have the ritual reading of the text, or at least the touch, being in touch with the text from somebody in the lineage. You know, you get hit on the head with somebody. You know, you've actually been connected to the mandala of this teaching. And yet it also works when we don't have that, if we approach it with the right attitude. There's many ways in which we've discovered that we've read things that have affected us profoundly. We've been very open to it, and it has affected us very profoundly. And you have to think, well, anything that's having that effect must be coming from the activity of the Buddha, like we say every day. You know, because the Buddha, everything emerges from the Buddha. Anything that's in line with the Buddha Dharma is actually emanating from the Buddha. So if you approach the text with that kind of faith, it seems that it does work, actually. I think it must also work if you're in the process, you are well connected with the mandala of awakening already through your own lineage. I think it does actually enable those things that we don't have a particular direct transmission person to person. Nonetheless, we're all ready to open ourselves to the influence, even if it's reached us somehow, hasn't it? It's reached us somehow. We've got some connection with it because we're able to pick it up and read it, or listen to it or hear it. So, yeah. So I guess you have to think there's a sort of spreading effect of Adhisthana where it starts to pervade everything, doesn't it? Sometimes it's very focused in something that's support for it, and sometimes it's just there, and it's already, just by being open, you're getting the transmission. Yeah, I'm sure it helps that we do the Shakyamuni Puja every morning, the Heart Sutra and the Shakyamuni. That it's really opening ourselves to the teacher, the Guru, the Buddha, and everything that has flowed from him over the last 2,500 years. Which is nothing in terms of eternity, isn't it? Anything more you wanted to say, Dashu?
Only for people who are coming this afternoon, I will be sort of referring to this quite crude map I drew, and it's on the Google site in the materials page. So you don't have to print it off, but you might find it useful in terms of keeping track of where this discussion goes, because it's quite a tangled web.
Good, thank you. So we could, that's good. We can just dedicate the punya, and then the next session we're going to be meditating. We dedicate this punya to the enlightenment of all sentient beings. May all sentient beings realize complete and perfect awakening. May the heart's awareness awaken in the unawakened. Where it has begun to stir, may it never fade, and may it awaken fully. Chanche semne rinpoche ma che panam je je je. Jeba nyamba mepadang kone kondi belwa sho. Chanche samne rinpoche ma che panam je je je. Jeba nyamba mepadang kone kondi belwa sho. Chanche samne rinpoche ma che panam je je je. Jeba nyamba mepadang kone kondi pelwa sho. Whole cosmos shakes. Truth has been spoken. Dharma chakra has been turned. All the Maras are running off scared.
Oh, it's only me. How's everybody?
There's 135.
Really?
Mm.
Goodness. Well, I don't know if I can say hello to everybody.